It started around 1740. At least that was the first time it was being told about Russians trading with the Norwegians. The Russians living around the White Sea in northern Russia, they had these fasting periods where they couldn't eat meat, so they needed fish, and so they sailed up to northern Norway to trade, and they knew that the Norwegians living here would need wood for building houses and boats, and wheat for, you know, baking bread and all that, and so they sailed up here to trade with the Norwegians living in Vardö and Hammerfest and all those little villages. They had relations going back several hundred years before the Pomor trade started. And I mean, Russians had been fishing up here for I mean, centuries, but it was only in the 1700s that they started realizing that they could perhaps trade with the people living here, not just fish in the oceans and such, because trade had been going on between Norwegians and Russians earlier, but not to such an extent, and not with the Pomors and the Norwegians as such. It was illegal, first of all, because the king in Denmark, Norway, didn't want this to happen. I mean, they had Bergen as the main capital for trade in Norway, so Norwegians wanting to trade or buy things, they were required to sail down to Bergen. It started as smuggling, this trade. They smuggled in the goods and all that, and the people in customs, they probably didn't care too much about it, because they knew that it was important for people living in the northern regions to have this trade, because it was so important for them. That was why the so-called Moja Potvoja developed a peculiar mix of Norwegian, Russian, a bit of Dutch and German and English. I mean, but mainly Norwegian and Russian that they used to communicate, and it was never really written down. It was mostly an oral way of communicating, but it did work, and it was what they used for quite some time, until well, the late 1800s, when Norwegians started learning Russian, because they figured that, well, Russia is the way to, you know, that's the future. Of course, that didn't happen, but they wanted it to happen. There was, of course, wood, like this building we're in right now. It's built from Russian timber, and the floor, the ceiling, everything really, and they also brought flour for baking bread, and also smaller luxury items and other goods, like we have some examples here from what they brought with them, and little teacups and well, other things. But then in 1789, Vardö got trade rights, and this meant that they could trade freely with, well, not freely, but they could trade with the Russians. And it was encouraged because the government knew that the people living up here in northern Norway well, they weren't rich, but they wanted to control it because they didn't want the Russians to have too much presence. Yeah, because I mean, this is big Russia, big powerful Russia, and of course they feared it. They found it. They didn't think they could really trust these people as much as the people in Vardö would trust them. So and that's why the whole Pomor trade eventually died out because of restrictions and such. Norwegians did come to Russia, and Norwegians also traded with other peoples like the Sami and the Finns, and I mean lots of trading between different nations. But it was mainly the Russians who came to Norway to trade, and of course that was, I would imagine it would be rather nice for the people living up here to know that, you know, each summer they would become like a Russian merchant with everything they needed, and I mean, the only thing these Norwegians had was the fish. So, I mean, why not? It was an ideal situation for both parts. The Tsar granted them a stay in Russia if they took up a Russian citizenship. They could move to Russia, and those were the so-called Kola Norwegians who did move to Russia and settle there and become Russians. This was in the late 1800s, I believe, 1860s maybe, and they probably had a splendid time until the whole communist regime and the persecutions. They weren't welcome anymore, but they also weren't allowed to leave Russia, and the Norwegian government, they didn't really care too much about them and didn't do much to help these poor people who hunted down by Stalin and his cohorts, and so they had it quite rough. There were restrictions, as I mentioned earlier, made by the Norwegian government, and because, I mean, they feared the Russians, and they probably wanted this whole trade to end. So I believe it was in 1913 that the fishing was that Russians were banished from delivering fish to Norwegian ports, and then in 1914, of course, the First World War started, and things got more complicated, and then the Russian Revolution, and when it reached Arkhangelsk in I believe 1920, that is generally considered to be the end of the Pomor trade.